When we think of ancient Rome, we imagine marble forums, gleaming togas, and aqueducts delivering pristine water to noble villas. But beneath this polished image lies a world far grittier, a civilization where daily hygiene teetered between innovation and horror. This is not a story of emperors and conquests, but of shared sponges, pigeon dung, and the stench of unwashed bodies echoing through the bathhouses. For 12 chapters, we will peel back the perfumed veil of Roman cleanliness and reveal a world both fascinating and foul. So before we descend into the steaming thermae and urine-soaked alleys of the Eternal City, like this video and subscribe. Only if you dare to explore the dirtier side of history. The heart of Roman hygiene beat not in private chambers, but in the great steaming lungs of the city. The public baths. Called thermae, these sprawling complexes were more than just places to rinse off grime. They were arenas of daily ritual, gossip, and exposure. From senators to slaves, all classes stripped down and soaked together, their bare bodies glistening beneath vaulted ceilings as marble statues gazed down with indifferent perfection. The water, once a marvel of aqueduct engineering, flowed in daily but rarely changed in the pools themselves, especially in the larger caldaria and tepidaria, where hundreds bathed in sequence. The illusion of cleanliness was strong, but under the surface it was murky. Literally. Men with festering wounds, children with lice, elders with running sores all shared the same liquid sanctuary. And yet, for the Romans, cleanliness was as much about ritual and appearance as it was about health. The baths offered a social theater where the act of scrubbing became a public performance. Bodies were scraped and oiled, muscles flexed in calculated casualness, and whispers passed from lip to lip over the splash of communal waters. But this performance extended beyond the pools, into the intimate recesses of the latrinae. The public toilets attached to bathhouses. Here, a row of stone seats lined the walls, evenly spaced but without partitions, inviting patrons to relieve themselves side by side, in the open, like birds on a ledge. Conversation never ceased, not even here. Beneath the seats, water flowed gently to carry waste away, but the real horror lay in what followed. Instead of paper, a single communal sponge on a stick, the xylospongium, waited in a bucket of vinegared water to be shared by all. Dip, wipe, rinse, repeat. This was the rhythm of Roman sanitation. No one questioned it. No one protested. It was simply how things were done. To the modern mind, the thought of such casual intimacy with the filth of others is repulsive, even nightmarish, but to the Romans, it was the fabric of daily life, woven into the architecture of the city, the rhythms of the body, and the rituals of citizenship. Bathing wasn't private, cleanliness wasn't solitary, and dirt, in many forms, was a shared experience. These baths, grand as they were, masked a paradox. Rome was a city obsessed with order and form, yet in its most personal rituals it invited chaos and contagion. The thermae were temples of hygiene, and yet they were also breeding grounds of illness. The sponge, reused countless times, was not a tool of sanitation, but a symbol of stoic endurance. And those seated in the latrinae, from plebs to patricians, all bared themselves equally, not just in flesh, but in vulnerability. Perhaps this is what made Rome enduring. Not its monuments or military might, but its ability to normalize the grotesque, to ritualize the repulsive, to turn even the act of defecation into a communal moment of human theater. The steam may have clouded the air, but it could never fully mask the truth beneath the surface. Soap, as we know it today, never lathered the backs of Romans. Instead, they turned to something more ancient, more elemental, and far more sensual: olive oil. In the warm, echoing halls of the thermae, the scent of pressed olives mingled with sweat and steam, as men and women coated their bodies in a glistening layer of golden oil. This was not an indulgence, but a necessity, for without soap to lift the grime, oil became the intermediary, loosening the dirt from the pores, softening the skin, and preparing it for the ritual scraping. And then came the strigil, a crescent-shaped blade of bronze or iron, cold against warm flesh, curved like the moon, and as unforgiving. In practiced hands, the strigil slid across oiled limbs, collecting the mixture of dust, sweat, oil, and dead skin into curling ribbons of filth. Athletes, especially, were portrayed in this act, their muscles taut as they cleansed themselves after sport. Pompey's mosaics immortalized them mid-motion, the strigil poised like a painter's brush, the oil gleaming like varnish. This daily exfoliation was both hygienic and performative. Slaves often carried the strigil for their masters, heating the tool or applying oil in gentle circles before each scrape. For the rich, it became a status symbol. For the poor, it was sometimes all they could afford. In a world without shampoo, conditioners, or foaming cleansers, this method was strangely effective, natural, chemical-free, and remarkably thorough. But it came at a cost. The same strigil was often shared among bathers, just as the sponge in the latrine had been. Though some brought their own, many did not. And in these intimate gestures, scraping behind knees, across backs, over shoulders, there lingered the potential for disease, the risk of infection, the unspoken acceptance of exposure. Yet no one recoiled. The scraping was as normal as eating. It was not seen as invasive but necessary, an act of public purity wrapped in private discomfort. In every bathhouse, the hiss of oil warming over brazier coals, the metallic rasp of strigil on skin, and the sighs of the newly cleansed formed a chorus of civilization, raw, rhythmic, and ancient. The olive oil itself was a symbol of the Mediterranean world, flowing not just onto skin but into food, rituals, and offerings to the gods. Its presence in hygiene rituals blurred the line between body and spirit, between cleanliness and sanctity. The oil was absorbed not just by flesh but by identity. And though the scraping removed the visible dirt, what remained was a scent, a sheen, a mark of participation in Rome's unspoken codes. To be oiled and scraped was to be Roman. To smell of olives was to be civilized. It is easy to romanticize this process now, to picture marble bodies gleaming under soft torchlight, bronze strigils catching the glow like jewelry. But the reality was far grittier. The floor beneath was slick with old oil and grime. The strigil could nick skin and leave tiny wounds, and the oil, reused by some bath attendants, might carry remnants of the last man's sweat. Still, there was elegance in this mess, a discipline in the discomfort. Rome turned hygiene into art, into ritual, into spectacle. They did not fear the body, they celebrated it, even in its filth. And with each scrape, they declared without words that order could rise from sweat, that dignity could emerge from dirt, and that cleanliness was not about sterility, but about style, strength, and shared belief. Among the cobbled streets and shaded insulae of ancient Rome, cleanliness did not always smell sweet. In fact, one of the most prized substances for cleaning, whitening, and restoring freshness was the very thing most modern noses would flee from: urine. To the Romans, it was not waste but resource, not filth but function. Collected in jars that lined the alleys and public urinals called foulonicae, or even from chamber pots poured into roadside containers, urine became the unsung hero of Roman sanitation. Its value lay in its chemistry, though the people of the time would not have used that word. Fermented for days until its pungency peaked, stale urine became rich in ammonia, a powerful cleaning agent that could strip grease, remove stains, and revive the dullness of soiled cloth. It was particularly prized by the fullers, the launderers of Roman garments, who stomped on tunics and togas in vats filled with a mixture of water and aged urine. Their bare feet immersed in what we now recoil from, yet they regarded as essential. These workshops filled the air with a sharp, acrid tang that clung to the walls and clothes alike. But to Rome's citizens, it was simply the scent of industry. Emperor Vespasian, ruling from 69 to 79 AD, was no fool to this. Ever the practical statesman, he introduced a tax on urine collection itself, recognizing its profitability. When mocked for taxing such a foul substance, he is said to have held a coin beneath his nose and declared, "Pecunia non olet," money doesn't stink. The phrase stuck, not just as a defense of fiscal pragmatism, but as a lasting testament to Rome's ability to commodify even its own excretions. But this was not merely a quirk of economics. The reliance on urine reflected something deeper, a civilization that left no aspect of life or body unused. Where others saw waste, Rome saw utility. Where others might discard, Rome distilled and repurposed. In homes, diluted urine might be used to scrub floors or clean leather. In military camps, it could sterilize wounds or cleanse garments stained by travel. Even the city's most elegant families, when faced with soiled linens, sent them to the Fulonikai without shame. Yet for all its uses, the smell was inescapable. The fullers' workshops, clustered near riverbanks or the city's edges, often bordered poorer districts, where the stench mingled with the scent of animal hides, rotting refuse, and unwashed bodies. To live among it was to breathe Rome's efficiency and its indifference to delicacy. There was no embarrassment in its use, no taboo around its purpose. Urine was folded into daily life as seamlessly as olive oil or grain. It was not hidden. It was not whispered. It sloshed in open buckets, was exchanged for coin, and flowed down the city's drains with the same gravity that governed Roman law. And in this everyday ritual, this sour-smelling miracle of maintenance, we glimpse a world that prized practicality above all. The Romans did not shy from discomfort. They did not disguise necessity with euphemism. Their cities pulsed with life, and that life in all its mess was put to work. In every splash of urine poured into a fuller's vat, in every toga brightened under its sting, Rome affirmed its genius, to make even the lowliest substance serve the glory of the state. If the scent of cleanliness in ancient Rome was tinged with the sting of ammonia, then the pursuit of a perfect smile came with an even sharper bite. Among the wealthier classes and those with a taste for self-presentation, dental hygiene was no frivolous afterthought. White teeth were seen as a mark of beauty, youth, and even virtue. But lacking fluoride, mint, or manufactured pastes, the Romans turned once again to their most abundant resource, urine. Not just any urine, but fresh, warm, human urine. Diluted, swished, and sometimes gargled, in a daily ritual that would make modern stomachs churn. To the Romans, it was less revolting than it was rational. Ammonia, that invisible alchemist hidden in waste, was known to whiten. And in a society where appearance held political and social value, this method, though pungent, promised results. There was no shame in its use. In fact, it was so widespread that poets mocked it openly, not because it was taboo, but because it was common. The poet Catullus, writing in the 1st century BC, sneered at a Spaniard named Ignatius who grinned too widely, his gleaming teeth polished not by soap or chalk, but, as the verses suggest with biting wit, by his own country's urine. It was a cultural dig layered with disgust and familiarity. Everyone knew what Catullus meant. Everyone knew it worked. The practice was simple. A small amount of urine, aged just enough to release its active compounds, would be mixed with water or other abrasives like pumice. The mixture was then used as a rinse or applied with cloth. No brushes, no foam, just contact, motion, and time. And with each rinse, each sour swallow or gagged grimace, Romans cleansed not just their teeth but their status, especially in urban centers where close quarters and constant speech made dental display unavoidable. Merchants smiled to reassure, senators to persuade, lovers to seduce. A yellow grin, crusted with decay, could undermine a man's respectability faster than a political blunder. And so they endured it. The poor may have lacked wine, but they still had mouths to clean. Even in the backstreets of Trastevere or the overcrowded insulae of the Subura, one could find rinse pots beside wash basins, filled with the liquid gold of oral care. There were no artificial sweeteners to mask the scent. There were no fragrant herbs to distract the senses. The taste was real, the effect reliable. But this was not madness, it was method. Rome did not fear the grotesque if it served a purpose. The body, in all its functions, was an instrument to be managed, optimized, even harvested. Waste was not to be wasted, and so the mouth became a site of daily contradiction. beauty cultivated through repulsion, health pursued through hazard. Even today, archaeologists studying Roman skulls are often surprised by the relatively low levels of tooth decay among urban populations, especially considering the carbohydrate-rich diets of the poor. Perhaps the urinal mouthwashes, offensive as they sound, offered some genuine antibacterial benefit. Or perhaps the Romans were simply too stubborn to let rot win. To them, a clean smile was worth the cost, however sour. And when they lifted their voices in forum or feast, laughter rising over amphorae of wine, they did so with mouths scrubbed in shame and triumph alike. Proof that in Rome, even beauty had a bitter taste. Beneath the marble busts and stoic profiles of Roman matronae, beneath the ironed folds of silk stelae and the carefully choreographed gestures of modesty, there lurked a relentless obsession with hair. Its length, its texture, but most of all, its color. Blonde hair, that golden cascade so foreign to the native Italic population, became a marker of luxury, seduction, and elite fashion. Yet in a city where most citizens were dark-haired by birth, achieving the coveted hue required a peculiar kind of alchemy, one that called not upon gold, but upon ash, vinegar, and pigeon dung. The process was as unpleasant as it was painstaking. First, the hair would be soaked in a mixture of caustic compounds, ashes for stripping pigment, vinegar to soften the strands, and pigeon droppings fermented for their bleaching properties. The ammonia in the dung did the work, lifting color from the follicles with a slow, acrid burn. The scent was unmistakable. The application was messy, but the result, pale, brassy strands, was considered worth every sting. This wasn't fringe practice. It was mainstream vanity. Pliny the Elder himself, writing in his Natural History, documented the concoction not as an oddity but as a beauty recipe. Roman women, especially those of wealth and status, wore their hair like armor, twisted, coiled, braided into impossibly elaborate crowns that signaled class and refinement. And for those unable or unwilling to risk their scalps to dung and lye, there were wigs, gleaming caps of stolen sunshine, often made from the hair of captured Germanic women or northern slaves. These wigs were prized imports, traded at a premium and worn with pride. To don blonde hair was to borrow the allure of the exotic, to signal both wealth and erotic independence. Prostitutes, too, often wore blonde wigs by law or custom, distinguishing themselves in crowded urban spaces with a flash of yellow atop their heads. Thus, the same color came to signify both elite fashion and carnal availability, an irony not lost on satirists of the time. Yet beneath this cosmetic duality lay a deeper truth. Rome, for all its concrete and conquest, was a city gripped by appearance. The female body, in particular, became a canvas for both social ambition and silent suffering. Bleaching the hair was painful. The scalp could burn. The strands could fall out in clumps. But vanity was relentless. Wigs could itch. They could shift or smell in the summer heat. But beauty demanded obedience. In a world without shampoo, conditioners, or regulated salons, these treatments took place in cramped rooms, with basins of filth and slaves attending with trembling hands. And still, the transformation continued. Each application of dung, each strand of woven foreign hair, a ritual of belonging. It is easy from the vantage point of the modern world to laugh at the absurdity of pigeon dung as a beauty product, to recoil at the thought of dung-smeared curls drying in the Mediterranean sun. But in Rome, this was no joke. It was aspiration. It was identity. It was survival in a society where a woman's worth could be measured by her head, not her mind, but the gold upon it. And so they endured the sting, the shame, and the smell, because in a world of marble and myth, sometimes beauty had to be built with the humblest of ingredients, and sometimes glory began with a bird. Night fell gently over Rome, casting shadows across tiled atriums in the flickering lamplight of insula, but for many, rest brought no peace. Beneath the woven linen sheets, beneath the straw-stuffed mattresses or the simple wooden frames of poor homes, tiny invaders stirred in silence. lice, fleas, and bedbugs, invisible armies feasting under cover of darkness. Hygiene during the day may have been ritualized, even theatrical, but once the oil was scraped and the perfumes faded, the night revealed another layer of Roman life. Itching, crawling, and utterly inescapable. Even the wealthy who lounged in ivory-inlaid beds draped in imported fabrics were not spared. Bedding was rarely washed thoroughly. Sheets, often reused and only shaken out in the open air, harbored generations of vermin. Mattresses filled with straw or wool became fertile nesting grounds impossible to clean from within. And so, as sleep descended, so too did a slow, insistent torment. The philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, in all his stoic composure, once complained in writing that he awoke covered in bugs. His words, carved from self-restraint, still carried a quiet frustration that echoed what millions of Romans must have felt night after night, a resignation to the indignity of infestation. The wealthy might send their linens to be aired in the sun, might shake their robes over balconies or burn sprigs of herbs to mask the mustiness, but none of this truly purged the problem. For the poor, sleeping often six or more to a cramped room, there was no such pretense. Children scratched at sores as they curled beside parents whose own bodies bore the red trails of nightly visitors. In the densely packed tenements of the Zabura or Aventine, the warmth of collective living only made things worse. Heat bred insects. Closeness spread them, and the cycle never broke. Archaeologists, in peeling back layers of dirt from Roman dwellings, have discovered not only the remains of pots and coins, but the preserved eggs of lice nestled in ancient fabric. These microscopic fossils, barely visible to the naked eye, tell a story more intimate than any mosaic or inscription. A story of bodies too numerous, too tightly packed, too weary to resist the rhythms of the natural world. Yet even here, Rome endured with a strange kind of pragmatism. It did not attempt to eliminate what it could not control. Instead, it adapted. Combs with closely spaced teeth, precursors to the modern NIT comb, have been found among Roman grooming tools, their purpose unmistakable. Some women would coat their hair in olive oil or resin to smother lice. Others would shave their children's heads entirely, leaving the scalp smooth and clean, if vulnerable. And still the insects returned, persistent as the empire itself. The infestation became part of the unspoken cost of civilization, a price paid not in coin, but in restless sleep. To live in Rome was to share not just in law and language, but in discomfort. Insects knew no class. They cared not for citizenship, nor rank, nor virtue. They fed on all alike, binding the bodies of rich and poor in a quiet equality of flesh. And in the silence of the sleeping hour, Rome revealed its truest self. Not in marble or politics, but in the twitch of an ankle, the scratch of a shoulder, the shared sigh of a people longing for rest in a world that never truly slept clean. In a city where sweat mingled with smoke, where bathwater stagnated and bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder in markets, temples, and theaters, the air itself could seem thick with the scent of humanity. Pungent, unfiltered, unrelenting. And so the Romans, ever concerned with appearances and the impressions of others, turned to the one remedy that did not cleanse but concealed: perfume. It was not mere vanity, it was survival of the senses. Oils pressed from roses, violets, myrrh, and spikenard were imported in tiny alabaster flasks from Arabia, Egypt, and India, their contents more precious than gold. To wear perfume was to ascend above the grime, to mark oneself as refined even when the skin beneath had not been touched by water for days. Among the nobility, especially during festivals or formal gatherings, the scent of a person became a form of speech. A man might speak of power with a trace of cinnamon oil on his robes, while a woman might summon allure with the heavy sweetness of jasmine. These oils were dabbed behind the ears, at the wrists, across the neck, and for some, even beneath the arms and between the thighs, where the body's heat would slowly release the fragrance into the air. But perfume was not reserved for the elite. The poor too sought refuge in scent, though their options were humbler. Herbs crushed in olive oil, stale wine boiled with lavender, even animal fat mixed with petals gathered from public gardens. The intent was the same: to mask the scent of sweat, of unwashed cloth, of feet blistered in sandals that had walked the same dusty roads for years. Bathing was not always available, especially in winter or during times of drought, and even the thermae had limits. But a vial of scent, tucked into a sleeve or worn on a leather thong, offered a kind of dignity that no soap could promise. Emperors embraced the art of scent with excess that bordered on madness. Nero, decadent and theatrical, was said to have drenched his banquet halls in perfume, releasing clouds of fragrance from hidden ceiling panels while servants sprinkled petals along the floor. Guests would leave not just full of wine but soaked in scent, their hair clinging with floral oil. Some found it divine, others found it suffocating. But none could ignore it. To smell was to signal, and those signals mattered. A woman reeking of sweat might be mistaken for a slave. A man carrying the scent of ambergris or saffron could be assumed wealthy or at least ambitious. Even among soldiers, records tell of commanders anointing themselves before battle, not out of softness, but as a performance of control, of order amidst chaos. Yet there was always tension between the perfume and what lay beneath. For every sweetened wrist, there lingered a sour armpit. For every rose-scented tunic, there was a foot wrapped in rotten leather. The illusion could not hold forever, and in that gap between appearance and reality, Rome revealed itself once more. A civilization that worshipped the senses yet feared their truths. A people who could not stop the stench, but could at least pretend. Perfume was not just about fragrance. It was about denial, about aspiration, about the human desire to be more than what the body betrays. And in this cloud of incense and sweat, of flowers and filth, the empire breathed, loud, fragrant, and unwilling to face its own smell head-on. Amid the grandeur of imperial forums and triumphal arches, where the ego of Rome etched itself into marble and bronze, there existed another kind of monument, unadorned, practical, and profoundly democratic: the public toilet. Known as pharaikai, these open latrines were some of the most essential and widely used public utilities in the ancient world, and yet they reveal a truth more intimate than any triumphal inscription. In the eyes of bodily function, there was no emperor, no senator, no slave. There was only the need to sit, to relieve, to wipe, and to do so side by side. Step into a Roman latrina, and the first thing that disappears is privacy. Stone benches lined the walls in long, unbroken rows with circular holes carved evenly at sitting height, sometimes 20 or more in a single room. There were no stalls, no partitions, no walls between strangers or kin. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, tunics hitched, knees bent, chatting as they voided themselves in full view of one another. In this most vulnerable posture, Romans carried on conversations about politics, weather, market prices. Nothing was off the table, including the sound of digestion or the splash below. These spaces weren't hidden in alleyways or tucked into corners. They were often attached to bathhouses, forums, or marketplaces, central, open, and undeniably public. Waste was carried away by flowing water beneath the seats, an engineering marvel powered by Rome's aqueduct-fed drainage system. But the real curiosity was the shared tool of cleansing, the infamous xylospondium, a sponge affixed to a stick, resting in a trough of vinegared water. One per room, or at best a few. Users would dip it, wipe, rinse, and leave it for the next. It was practical, yes. But hygienic? Hardly. Still, no one recoiled. This was Rome, where discipline extended not just to armies and orators, but to the bowels. Even emperors were not above this ritual. Though palaces might have had their private latrines, records and excavations suggest that elites frequently used public facilities, especially when in the city. The ruins of Ostia Antica, Rome's once bustling port town, preserve one such latrina, a semicircular room with 20 seats facing inward like a council of necessity. Here, archaeologists believe merchants, magistrates, and perhaps even officials of senatorial rank once sat in mutual understanding of human frailty. There was no shame in it. Instead, there was solidarity. The latrine became a strange leveler of status, a place where robes of purple and simple tunics were lifted alike, where sandals rested against cold stone and the sounds of release echoed without judgment. The etiquette of these spaces was unspoken but strict. No eye contact. Conversation was acceptable, but glances were rare. Jokes, while not prohibited, were risky. A slip of the tongue might lead to a slip of dignity. Still, humor crept in. Graffiti scratched into latrine walls reveals crude jokes, insults, even declarations of love, all composed with trousers down, a reminder that creativity needs no stage. What makes these spaces so revealing is not just the architecture, but what they represent. A Rome that acknowledged the body without illusion. Where other cultures hid their filth, Rome organized it, structured it, and gave it marble seats. In these rooms of shared exposure, there was no need to pretend. The empire may have stood on ceremony, but it squatted in truth. And in doing so, it reminded every citizen, from emperor to errand boy, that beneath the pomp, beneath the power, they were all, in the end, made of the same mortal needs. The roar of the Colosseum, the clash of blades, the final gasp of a fallen man, these were the sounds of glory and death in ancient Rome. But beyond the blood and sand, beyond the spectacle designed to stir the masses and feed imperial pride, there existed another, more intimate economy, one rooted not in valor but in vanity. For while gladiators were seen as brutal instruments of entertainment, their bodies, honed to perfection and drenched in sweat, became objects of desire, and their secretions, astonishingly, a luxury cosmetic. It began in the stands, where women, matrons in pearls and slaves in tunics alike, watched not just the combat, but the glistening bodies of fighters moving like sculpted gods under the sun. Their muscles shone with oil, their skin streaked with dust and perspiration, and in that moment, they were more than men. They were icons of virility, danger, and erotic power. After the games, some of these women would pay to collect the sweat and scraping residue from the bodies of victorious gladiators. Attendants, often slaves themselves, would use strigils to remove the layer of oil, blood, and perspiration from the gladiator's skin, storing the runoff in small pots. This mixture, foul in composition but alluring in idea, was believed to possess aphrodisiac qualities and skin-healing properties. Roman physician Galen, writing in the 2nd century AD, did not shy away from this curious practice. He noted that some women applied gladiator sweat to their faces to reduce wrinkles, invigorate the skin, or attract lovers. To them, it was not disgusting, it was potent, intimate, even magical. Owning such a relic meant possessing a fragment of raw masculine essence, a trace of the arena's danger rubbed directly into the pores. The irony was profound. These same gladiators, many of them slaves or criminals, were socially inferior, unable to vote, to marry freely, or even to speak in court. Yet their sweat, their grime, their very excretions were hoarded and treasured by the very society that kept them in chains. In this paradox, Rome once again revealed its twisted elegance, able to transform violence into beauty, humiliation into commerce. Vendors outside amphitheaters sold tiny jars of gladiator oil like sacred relics, and while most purchases were silent, the implications were bold. These weren't perfumes. They weren't ointments prescribed by physicians. They were trophies of lust disguised as skincare. For the wearer, it wasn't just about smoother skin. It was about participation in a fantasy of power, absorbing, quite literally, the strength and sensuality of the arena. And it wasn't limited to sweat. Some women reportedly used the blood of fallen gladiators as a cure for infertility or epilepsy, consuming or anointing themselves with the warm, coppery liquid of the freshly dead. It was a form of ancient, sympathetic magic, where proximity to strength could confer its essence to the weak. These beliefs, strange as they sound, were not hidden in shadows. They were part of the fabric of Roman popular culture, whispered in bathhouses, joked about in plays, scribbled in graffiti. And beneath the laughter, the revulsion, or the arousal, lay the same primal thread. The human body, in all its fluids and frailty, was both terrifying and sacred. Gladiator sweat was not just a commodity, it was a mirror reflecting the Roman soul, obsessed with domination, intoxicated by physicality, and forever blurring the line between spectacle and intimacy. In a world where power was etched into the flesh, the essence of a fighter was worth more than gold. And so, while the sand drank the blood, the jars captured the sweat, and Rome, as always, turned even suffering into style. When the Mediterranean sun gave way to winter's breath, when the tiled courtyards of Roman homes turned slick with frost, and the wind howled through narrow streets like a ghost denied warmth, Rome changed. The same city that sang with fountains and sweat in summer fell into a stillness made brittle by cold. And in that cold, hygiene unraveled. Bathing, already a public affair fraught with shared tools and questionable waters, became a perilous decision in the colder months. For the poor who lived in crumbling insulae with broken shutters and no heating, to bathe in winter was to invite illness. The chill lingered on damp skin, clung to wet hair, slipped into the lungs. Colds were feared not as nuisances but as potential death sentences, and so many simply stopped washing altogether. Their bodies, wrapped in the same rough tunics day after day, grew rank. Layers of sweat, dust, and smoke settled into the folds of their clothes like sediment. Hands went unwashed, feet blistered within sodden sandals, and the smell of humanity thickened in every alley. Even in the grand thermae, the great public baths that had long served as temples of cleanliness and camaraderie, attendance dwindled. The water was still warm, heated by the hypocaust, a marvel of Roman engineering that circulated hot air beneath the stone floors and inside the walls. But the journey there was not. To walk through the icy streets, to undress in the frigid apoditerium, to risk wet skin in the open air afterward. It was a trial not all were willing to endure. The rich, cocooned in their villas and estates, fared better. Their private baths were stoked by teams of slaves who fed wood into furnaces day and night, keeping the floors toasty and the water steaming. The hippocaust's quiet hum became a sign of wealth, the ability not just to wash, but to wash in warmth. Still, even in these private sanctuaries, winter left its mark. Pipes froze. Fires failed. And the psychological barrier of cold remained. Cleanliness in the colder months became less about ritual and more about strategy. Oil rubdowns replaced immersion. Towels heated over braziers were used to wipe down exposed skin without touching water. Some rubbed themselves with dust or ash to absorb sweat and odor, a practice inherited from older rural traditions. And always, the perfume returned, clinging to collars and cloaks, masking what the water no longer reached. For the city itself, winter brought more than discomfort. It brought stagnation. The water supply, reliant on flowing aqueducts and cisterns, could slow or clog. Latrines froze, waste accumulated. Rats and disease crept into corners. The philosopher Seneca, living near a bathhouse in Rome, once wrote not of the cold, but of the racket. Men groaning under massages, the slap of wet flesh, the shriek of plunges into hot pools. But in winter, even this chaos quieted, replaced by the soft rustle of unwashed limbs beneath woolen cloaks. It was as though Rome held its breath until spring. And yet, the empire endured. The people adapted. Filth was tolerated. Sickness was mourned and then ignored. Rome had no soap, no germ theory, no disinfectants. It had only tradition, temperature, and the human will to survive. In winter, that survival meant accepting grime as armor, stink as insulation, and abstinence from cleanliness as wisdom. It meant learning year after year that the body could be neglected if only the fire was kept alive. And so, beneath the grandeur of mosaics and columns, the eternal city shivered, stank, and slept through the season, wrapped not in linen or dignity, but in the quiet, clinging misery of a hygiene abandoned. In the heart of Rome, where aqueducts arched like frozen waves across the sky and senators debated beneath the marble hush of temples, There lived millions whose bodies bled in silence. Roman women, whether patrician or plebeian, slave or citizen, faced the monthly reality of menstruation in a world that offered no pads, no tampons, no commercial remedies, only improvisation, trial, and deeply embedded cultural discomfort. Menstruation was rarely discussed openly in Roman literature, and when it was, it came shrouded in superstition or scorn. Blood was seen not only as a marker of fertility, but as a potential pollutant, a force that could wither crops, dull steel, or sour wine. Within this fear and fascination, women crafted solutions both practical and peculiar. The most common approach was simple linen, soft rags, sometimes rolled or folded, inserted or worn between the thighs, washed and reused in a cycle as regular as the moon. But in a city where washing was a luxury and soap non-existent, cleanliness was often sacrificed to discretion. These rags were not sterile. They were rarely aired or sun-dried properly. And in cramped quarters, the smell, the discomfort, the risk of infection, they all became part of the unspoken cost of womanhood. For those with access to nature's bounty, sea sponges were another choice. Soaked in vinegar or wine to stiffen and cleanse them, they were gently inserted, acting as absorbent plugs not unlike the tampons of millennia later. Greek physician Soranus, writing in the 2nd century and widely read in Rome, described such methods in his gynecological texts, outlining with clinical calm what most men of the time preferred not to imagine. Yet for many there was no sponges, no linen, no guidance. Slaves, field laborers, and market vendors often relied on scraps, bits of wool, moss, or even dried grass tied into cloth. Others simply let it flow, wearing darker garments during their days of bleeding and hoping the city's stench would mask their own. There were no sanitary bins, no disposal systems. Blood found its way into the alleys, into bathhouse drains, into the cushions of communal seating. And with it came not just discomfort, but judgment. A woman seen washing too intently in the bathhouse might invite stares. A stain on a tunic could spark whispers. And yet, for all this, menstruation was never entirely hidden. It lived on the edge of public life, an open secret, a monthly mystery that shaped everything from household schedules to religious rituals. Some temples restricted bleeding women from entry, believing their presence could desecrate the divine. Midwives, often older women versed in herbal remedies, offered mixtures of rue, pennyroyal, and honey to regulate cycles or ease cramps, though their knowledge danced dangerously close to that of abortifacients, another taboo hidden in plain sight. But perhaps the strangest truth is how little the empire changed to accommodate this universal experience. Streets were paved, laws were codified, baths were built with geometric precision, but for the half of Rome that bled, no public provision was made. The burden was borne quietly, with rags stuffed into waistbands, with herbal teas sipped in the dark, with whispered advice passed from mother to daughter in kitchens and courtyards. And in that silence, a quiet resilience bloomed. Rome, with all its gods and generals, could not engineer dignity for menstruating women. So they made their own, stitched from linen, soaked in vinegar, wrapped in instinct. Beneath the mosaics and monuments, the women of Rome bled, endured and moved forward, their pain unseen, their solutions improvised, their strength unquestionable. Rome, at its height, pulsed with life. Bustling markets, thunderous forums, bathhouses echoing with laughter and debate. But that life, dense and unrelenting, left behind a trail of waste and death that no aqueduct or law could fully cleanse. For beneath the marble arcades and beside the shadowed alleys of the eternal city, rot lingered. Trash piled in corners. Animal carcasses discarded by butchers or struck down in traffic lay bloated in the sun, and sometimes among them were bodies. Human ones, too poor for proper burial, too lost to be claimed, too numerous to be quickly removed. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest codified laws, clearly forbade the burial or burning of corpses within city walls, an attempt to contain both stench and sickness. But the law was an ideal. The reality was far more putrid. As the population surged past 1 million, Rome's infrastructure groaned beneath its own weight. Narrow streets clogged with carts and pedestrians offered little room for organized waste disposal. Dumping became habitual. Broken pottery, spoiled grain, offal, feces, all were tossed from upper-story windows into the roads below. And though some districts employed slave crews to sweep the streets or collect refuse, their work was patchy at best, hampered by corruption, underfunding, or simple exhaustion. Epidemics like ghosts drifted easily through this filth. Typhus, dysentery, and worse claimed lives in waves, their progress silent and steady. Flies bred in dung, rats nested in waste piles and water sources, though once a triumph of Roman engineering, grew tainted at the edges. Public fountains overflowed with voices and buckets, but not always with purity. Disease moved hand in hand with decay, and the city adapted by learning to ignore it. The poor, packed into insula with collapsing walls and leaking roofs, suffered most. Without latrines or drainage, families emptied chamber pots into the streets. At night, the alleys ran slick. Children played beside cesspools. Women stepped over puddles that steamed in summer and froze in winter. Rome smelled of humanity, but also of what humanity left behind. And among the refuse, the dead waited. In times of plague or famine, the bodies became too many. Corpses of the unclaimed, slaves, beggars, foreigners, were hauled in carts or dragged to the edges of the city, where they might be burned in mass pyres or buried in shallow graves. But when the system failed, when war or disaster overwhelmed the city, the bodies simply remained. Covered by cloaks, left in gutters, gnawed by dogs, they became part of the scenery. Not every Roman ignored this decay. Some philosophers raged against it, calling for reform. Some religious sects viewed death in the streets as a moral failing. But change came slowly, if at all. To the average citizen, the stench was part of the air, the corpses part of the bricks. Archaeologists peeling back the layers of ancient Rome have found not just coins and tiles, but thick strata of waste. Centuries of buildup beneath apartments, testifying to lives lived over trash, to generations born atop rot. And yet, the city endured. Trade continued. Births outpaced deaths. People married, laughed, worshipped. Rome did not fall because of its filth, though the filth marked its every corner. Instead, it persisted because the people refused to look down. They walked forward through disease and decay, wrapped in togas and illusions, believing still in the greatness of the city, even as the gutters whispered otherwise. In the end, Rome was not just marble and might. It was blood and sewage, glory and putrefaction. Civilization built not above death, but around it. Rome, the eternal city, has long been remembered for its splendor. Its aqueducts and amphitheaters, its legions and laws, its poets, emperors and gods. But behind the grandeur lay another Rome, hidden in plain sight. A Rome of shared sponges and urine jars, of lice-filled beds and perfume-clouded streets, of women bleeding in silence and corpses decaying in gutters. It was not a footnote, it was the foundation. Every gleaming marble column cast a shadow, and in those shadows lived the daily rituals of hygiene, survival, and adaptation. The people of Rome, resilient, pragmatic, unflinching, did not avert their eyes from filth. They lived with it, around it, through it. They turned waste into tools, sweat into cosmetics, oil into cleanliness, and even death into routine. Their innovations were as much about endurance as elegance, born not from idealism but necessity. And in their struggle to stay clean amid the chaos, they left us more than mosaics and ruins. They left us a mirror, a reflection not only of what they were, but of what we still are. Bodies bound to earth, fighting daily battles between pride and biology, comfort and decay. So next time you reach for soap, flush a toilet, or sip clean water without thought, remember Rome. Not the Rome of triumphal arches, but the one that stank beneath them. The Rome that taught us civilization is not the absence of filth, but the persistence of dignity despite it. If this journey through Rome's hidden hygiene has surprised you, disturbed you, or even fascinated you, let us know in the comments. And if you've made it this far, perhaps consider liking the video and subscribing. For history is never truly clean, but it is always worth uncovering.